Welcome to the NMI podcast. And today we're speaking with Dr. Deanna Minich. And what fun this is going to be. So, we're going to dive into the topic of phytochemicals broadly and get into some specific areas. But before we get into this discussion, I'd like to speak to Deanna's background and academic achievements and so on briefly, and then we'll get into the conversation. So, she's largely an educator, scientist, international lecturer, teacher, and author with over 20 years of experience in academia and in the food and dietary supplement industries. Throughout the years, she's been active as a functional medicine clinician involved in clinical trials and her own practice, which is Food and Spirit. That's now become orientated towards groups and workshops and retreats. She's the author of 7 consumer books on wellness topics, 4 book chapters, over 50 scientific publications, and her background academically is in nutrition science, which includes a Master of Science degree in Human Nutrition and Dietetics from the University of Illinois in Chicago, a doctorate, PhD in Medical Sciences with a nutrition focus from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. For a decade, she was part of the research team, which was led by the father of functional medicine. I'm talking about. It's Dr. Jeffrey Bland. Served on the Nutrition Advisory Board for the Institute of Functional Medicine, as well as on the board of directors for the American Nutrition Association. Since 2013, she's been part of the faculty for Advanced Practice Module in Environmental Health by the Institute of Functional Medicine, has been teaching a graduate level course on metabolic detoxification at University of Western States, and over decades has taught thousands of nutrition classes for health coaches, fitness trainers, healthcare providers, and many others globally, by the Functional Medicine Coaching Academy, the Integrative and Functional Nutrition Academy, and the Institute for Integrative Nutrition. In conjunction with her academic degrees and teaching experience at university level, she's both a fellow, so FACN, and certified nutrition specialist, CNS, through the American College of Nutrition. She's currently Chief Science Officer at Symphony Natural Health, where she leads the medical advisory team, oversees scientific communications, and provides education leadership for that nutraceutical company. And more broadly, as you'll see, she's really passionate about helping others really understand these connections between diet, many, which are novel, I think, and really connect the dots between physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual health. So a huge privilege to have you on the podcast, Deanna. We're looking forward to this conversation. Thanks for your time.
Oh, my pleasure, Ben. In fact, I was listening as you're reading the bio of how you and I, through these years, have been very dynamic in our dance on nutrition. You inviting me over to the UK to give talks and getting to know the audience there. And then you and I also co-writing articles and even a book chapter. So it's been a pleasure to share this journey with you.
Yeah, likewise, feelings the same. It's funny where life leads us, and I'm really glad that since that early connection we had, that we've been able to maintain that continuity and collaborate on things. And always a privilege to have you come and speak at things that we're doing over in the UK. So thanks for the kind words. And I think a fun area to get into is this big area of focus for you, which is the rainbow of foods, and more specifically speaking to the concept of color and its relationship to like clinical nutrition, as well as, the biochemistry, which we can get into. And I thought a fun question to ask you is like, why the rainbow? Usually people give a diet a name like paleo, plant-based, vegan, something else. It just goes on and on. What led you to focus on color?
Well, that has both personal and professional underpinnings, I would say. If I think about my professional journey going through graduate school, doing my PhD research, just really exploring color as my own personal healing modality. And that was not even an intellectual thing. I wasn't even marrying that with my pursuit of phytochemicals and a lot of the scientific work that I was doing. It's not like I said, oh, I'm looking into phytochemicals. Let me look into color as a method of psychological healing. But in some way, all of these paths started to converge. And I must admit, being in nutrition for as long as I have, I've been pretty polarized to this word diet. Even though my book is called The Rainbow Diet, that was more of a publisher decision because that's how people think about food. But it's not necessarily how I think about food in the way of a relationship to food. We can think about diets as therapeutic type of interventions, and I think that that would be a more clinical way to contextualize that conversation of diet. But truly, as you and I both acknowledge, what is food? Food is our connection to nature. So I don't like to think about categorizing it within this type of box of a diet, which I think it was, various people had made comments about that word diet. What does it really mean? Is it truly a way of life, or is diet like die with a T on the end, as Dr. Brian Wansink would say? And I've always felt like people go on diets, they go off of them, they feel temporary, they don't feel part of your everyday life in a more meaningful way. So when it came to the rainbow, and I attribute this to a lot of my teachers, including Dr. Jeffrey Bland, because when I was working with him at the Functional Medicine Research Center, we did a lot of work on phytochemicals, right? Yeah. So it wasn't even like we set out to look at the rainbow or to look at color. It was just phytochemicals. And during my graduate school training, the 3 years that I spent in the lab were all on carotenoids, which were, well, and still are, the plant pigments that make nature look really pretty, like a lot of the red, orange, and yellow compounds. So I think I've always been destined to connect with color. Through nutrition, I made it a more artful connection because I just feel that that is where we want to go in our physical, emotional, mental, spiritual relationship with food. And it was scientifically more irrefutable than looking at diets, which seem to be, they would seem to come, they would seem to go. They were shiny objects, and I wanted something with a little bit more scientific gravitas. So plant foods seem to come to the top of the list for me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I remember a publication of yours and Jeff's actually, which was speaking to metabolic syndrome, and it was quite novel at the time in that, the main focus of managing metabolic disease was on diets, so different ratios of macronutrients. And you guys come out, and I can't remember the title of the publication, but it was essentially like there's all these phytochemicals that we're not talking about, basically, that are really important in this conversation, but people are, not really acknowledging. And, as you say, it's a different way of connecting people with food, I think, versus a more conventional dietary approach.
Yeah, and I think it shows us what we don't know because I kind of feel like the merry-go-round of protein, carbohydrate, and fat, and continuing to belabor the macronutrients, like how many of those seesaw conversations are we going to have,
Yeah.
right? There's even greater nuance of different kinds of protein and ratios and all of that. But I feel like the underdogs of nutrition have truly been the phytochemicals because we're still actually exploring them. And even the secondary metabolites of these phytochemicals are worth exploring. And then there's also, as you know, this whole conversation to be had about microorganisms and their interaction with phytochemicals. In fact, there are even, I would say, commercial pursuits at different companies looking at what the microorganism population of foods is contributing to our overall nutrient intake, right? So
Mhm.
the conversation continues to expand. Like you and I were talking about the dark matter of nutrition. Phytochemicals have been part of that dark matter. We haven't really known that they were there, and we still don't really have a proper estimate. But I do think that that's where a lot of the activity is happening in a non-caloric way, but in a cell signaling way. And a lot of the work on epigenetics and even genetics is informing a lot of that research on phytochemicals.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think that contrast is really powerful where we talk about, I don't know, it's 40 or so essential vitamins and minerals. And And then you discover that there's literally hundreds of thousands of different phytochemicals and more metabolites and like, as you mentioned, dark matter, which is, the uncategorized ones that we haven't even studied yet, right?
It's
It's
true.
yeah.
And all those interactions, Dave Jacobs at the University of Minnesota and others have talked before about food synergy. And so often, what has happened in nutrition science is the isolation of one compound and looking at it as a silo rather than as a synergistic complex and blend.
Hmm.
Case in point, I just gave a talk on carotenoids actually for a UK-based group this past weekend. And if we look at antioxidants in the 1990s, and through my training in the 1990s, when I was studying phytochemicals, there was a lot of fear about having isolated amounts of these phytochemicals because of their potential to interact in a more like a pro-oxidant way.
Yeah.
I think that with these plant compounds, there's still a lot that we have yet to uncover and discover in the way of how they work in isolation versus as a complex, as nature had intended them in this synergistic blend. So when people start to fear things like, and let's just get this out there now, like goitrogens, phytates, lectins, phytoestrogens, there are a lot of fear-mongering messages around these anti-nutrients, as they've been called, which I'd like us to even question that term.
Yeah.
Because in isolation, perhaps those compounds work very differently than in the matrix of the food, in which everything is in this harmonious balance and can also be altered depending on how we're preparing that food. And we're
Yeah.
doing a lot of things differently with food than we haven't done over the past decades, or even, 50 to 100 to 100 years ago, making these raw kale smoothies, celery juice, just a lot of these different things that we haven't seen genetically and are changing us epigenetically. So we do need to look at how we're relating to plants and how we're preparing them and how that serves our physiology.
Yeah, there's so much food for thought in that, excuse the pun, but one of the things that really springs to my mind is that it's almost like, there's a big piece of human behavior that we're not really acknowledging here, like that is related to getting so like focused on individual things that we lose sight of the forest for the trees. And, kale smoothies are a great example, is where, it's all about this particular food or phytochemical. And so we've got to like eliminate that or increase our intake of it massively. And, it just seems quite disconnected with the history of humanity's relationship with food in our environment. It does seem like quite a modern phenomena. Do you have anything
It
to
does.
say around that?
Yeah, it does. It's like if a little is good, more is better. And that's not always the case, especially when it comes to phytochemicals, because
Yeah,
if I look at how nature operates, it is very much in the way of diversity and complexity and using the best of both of those in order to operate.
hmm,
And so that's why if you have a crop, a garden, it will be much more abundant and fruitful if you have diverse plants versus just a monoculture, a monocrop.
yeah,
So I think the same principle applies that we have to look at all of those interconnections and really honor what nature is bringing to our plates rather than forcing a lot of these different types of structures and product isolations. And you and I are both in the nutraceutical industry, so we need to acknowledge that there is a role for therapeutic nutrients. There's no doubt about that.
yeah,
But when we isolate just one thing and just hammer on that day after day, how can we think that we're not throwing something potentially out of balance? It's kind of like when people take a lot of vitamin D and not think about, well, what does vitamin D utilize in the body to become active? It utilizes magnesium. So are we provoking a latent magnesium insufficiency or deficiency because we're hyperdosing on vitamin D,
yeah,
right? Because nutrition is a relationship science. And I think that we have become accustomed to nutrition as an all or nothing, black or white, yes or no, polarized kind of conversation.
yeah,
And this is something that I've learned from Jeff Bland, you, and other people, right? It's like it's the spectrum. And the more that we can see it as a whole in its completeness, I feel like the more it could work for us.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that's something that your work has done really, really well is tap into this a different way of thinking that's not about reductionism, not about exclusion. It's about, connecting us back with food and diversity through, spiritual and, behavioral and other type relationships. So a huge, acknowledgement of the work that you've been doing to, I guess, reconnect us with, with what we eat. And, on this theme of color, I'd like to dwell on that for a little bit before we get into other areas. But, I know, you had a fantastic publication and I'll signpost some of your writing to listeners in notes. But one of the publications you authored was back in 2019 in the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism, a review of science of colorful plant-based foods and practical strategies for eating the rainbow. And I'd like to unpack that a little bit. And the first question I've got for you is, well, what does color tell us about the biochemistry of food? Is it telling us anything important?
Well, that's what that paper was about. As I started to look at eating fruits and vegetables, which is very simplistic in the literature, but then you start to look at phytochemicals, fruits and vegetables, the copious science to look at reduced risk of different chronic diseases, I began to see a pattern. So kind of a pattern recognition of, okay, red colored foods seem to have some connection to inflammation and immune health. Now, not exclusively so, where we could say like strawberries are only for your immune system or to help with inflammation, but you know how just kind of a loose grouping of research, because we could also say cardiovascular disease in tomatoes, but is that because of its connection to inflammation? So I was looking at it more mechanistically. So if we take a functional medicine approach to phytochemicals, I was seeing that each of the colors had a functionality and assigning them that based on what I was seeing as a grouping in the literature. So just very quickly, red foods, again, inflammation and immune health. Orange foods seeing a connection with fat solubility and also reproductive health. So adipose tissue, carotenoids, which are they tend to be fat soluble and also connected to the reproductive system in a lot of different ways. Yellow, I saw as a connection to digestive health, green as it connects to cardiovascular health, and then blue purple connecting to the brain. So, and that was easier to teach. That was easier to talk with clients and groups about. By the way, I'm back in clinical practice 1 day a week where I'm back seeing people. And it's just kind of an interesting experience because I did a lot of that, but now I'm coming into it in a different headspace and kind of taking a more, just, I would say, even more well-rounded approach with that. So that became easier for me to convey to people. If I could say, well, you're not getting enough blue purple. Do you know that that has implications for your brain health? There are a lot of great studies on blueberries helping with learning and memory and mood. And if you don't have blueberries, you may not be able to have that function.
Hmm.
So I kept it within the context of thinking function, functional medicine, functional health, and knowing that nature is purposeful. It's not just kind of like a, I don't know, just a generic thing that there are red berries in the green forest at certain times of year, right? If you kind of look at the progression and, where these foods appear and when they appear, there's purpose to them. They have function in our bodies. So that's why I think having these distilled messages makes it more simple and applied for people to remember, okay, this is why I need all 7 colors or even all 5 colors on my plate throughout the day, because they're giving me function. I
Yeah.
mean, we could even nuance that further and say, within red, we need the whole spectrum of red colored foods. Because I remember talking with people and they would say, oh, I'm getting tomatoes. Every day I get tomatoes, but then there's no diversity within red.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something I was going to touch on because something you do really well in that pa particular paper we've just, referenced is, it's easy to slip into this trap of like, oh, I need to eat red, I'll eat tomatoes, I need to eat blue, I'll eat blueberries. But you've got like these enormous lists of, different foods that I wouldn't have even thought of that fit these color patterns. Like aubergines are purple. Yeah, of course they are, but you don't necessarily think like that. So, in terms of practical translation, it seems like a great tool for encouraging diversity and having people connect with different plants that they may not have thought of eating before.
Yeah, well, in the Rainbow Diet book, the one that I just finished, I tried to figure out like how do I make this even more simple, or as Jeff Bland would say, simplex, where you take the simple and the complex and you weave them together. And what I distilled it into was not just color, but then creativity, diversity, and rhythm. And so then talking with people about, okay, it's not just getting the colors, but then also the diversity of those colors, being creative with those colors, and having those colors within the natural rhythm of the seasonal cycles that we live within. I think that that is one of the overlooked principles of plants because plants are very intelligent. Depending on the environment that we're living in, they could inform our physiology, right? So if we're really in tune, and you and I have talked about some of these papers, right? So eating cherries out of season and altering things like lipid metabolism or even changing gene expression because of the polyphenols.
Yeah.
And what we're finding out, I mean, one of the things that most excites me is what I spoke on last year at the IFM AIC, which was the chronobiotic nature of phytochemicals, how these phytochemicals are actually helping our bodies to tell time. Or I see it a little bit deeper in the way of connect to nature. So, what is the circadian rhythm, right? It is the way that every night we are becoming hinged back into nature's rhythm in case we have fallen out of it. Thanks to melatonin and the circulation of a lot of these different hormones. I mean, we are perfectly orchestrated and tethered to nature. And phytochemicals are coming in to fortify that rhythmic connection because we are falling out of it. Artificial light at night is one culprit. It's one of the largest endocrine disruptors, I would say, that would be societally accepted. Many people know that plastics are bad, but they don't necessarily see that going to the supermarket at 8 p.m. with fluorescent lighting is an unhealthy thing to do, right? That there
Yeah.
are ways to mitigate that artificial light at night. So what I feel like phytochemicals are doing, and the most exciting of where I see research going, is the chronobiotic effects. And polyphenols as a class, as a large category of these phytochemicals, seem to play this role. And if we look at the organic chemistry of these polyphenols, they have that benzene ring together with a hydroxyl group. So it has this type of chemical configuration that can carry electrons very well, right? And somehow this structure is also, it looks like a sex steroid. It looks like some kind of hormone. So
Yeah.
it may even have light hypothalamic pituitary signaling roles or maybe pineal signaling. I don't think we quite know because a lot of this work is being done in animals. So, and what they do is they change the photoperiod of the animals because usually rodents sleep during the daytime for us and then they're awake at night. So then they flip their photoperiod and then they change their sleeping cycle to mimic the different seasons.
Mm.
So that's a lot of the extent of what we have in terms of looking at these different phytochemicals and how they might modulate things like melatonin synthesis or changing vitamin D levels. Ben, one of the studies that I did present that is just coming to my mind is even here's where we need to go clinically, but we're not there yet. The timing of when to take phytochemicals through the day. So there was a study looking at grape powder and showing how if we had grape powder during the morning, it helped to a greater extent with the immune system than when it was given at a different time. There was another study, this was in animals, however, in which they were giving resveratrol and found a pro-oxidant effect when it was given at a different time of day I think it was like the nighttime for the animal. Like it was when it was in the active phase, resveratrol was the antioxidant. When it was in the resting phase, resveratrol became the pro-oxidant.
Hmm.
So isn't that interesting? Like the dual nature of how these different phytochemicals can change their function depending on time.
Yeah.
And look at us with supplements, right? We just say like take this twice a day.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there's been very little work really investigating that, but there are pieces, as you say, like I'm aware of some work on, diet suggesting that where you land the food rather than the overall calories will help improve your metabolic health. And same with some supplements. I think there was some work done on coenzyme Q10 years ago where they found timing was really important. It's, which we overlook. It's like take it with breakfast and that's it.
Right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think also something that comes up for me in hearing you speak is this idea of plant intelligence. And it seems like a lot of these like biological benefits of the foods that we're eating, there is this reciprocal relationship with plants. And if you look at, the history of agriculture of a lot of the foods that are the mainstay of our diet, it's quite likely that the plants are speaking to us and vice versa. And there is a relationship, but we're not really acknowledging or unpacking that. I think food is a commodity in our society. It's not seen as something that interacts with our biology in really unique and interesting ways that can influence our not only our health and risk for chronic disease, but our vitality and flourishing. And things like circadian rhythm are not, it's not a disease, but it's a really important part of our biology that will get overlooked because it's not a disease, right?
It's true, but it oversees so many different things. Like our clock genes are determining our metabolism, how we detoxify. I mean, the liver is one of the greatest oscillating organs to that clock gene rhythm. And eventually we might even be doing genetic testing, looking at clock genes in people and how to optimize different organs because they're all a little bit different if you look at animal studies. But
Yeah.
yeah, just to what you said, I don't feel like there are a couple of things we don't have reverence for in our current society. One of them is plants. In fact, a lot of this, as we talk about plant-based diets, I often don't like to use that terminology because sometimes that means processed food plants, and that's not really what we're after, right? And then, I mean, plants comprise 80% of the biomass on this planet. And one of my mantras has been that plants are going to be what save us from extinction.
Mm.
And if we just go extinct, I mean, plants will take everything over. I mean, there's just an intelligence here that we're not connected into in that deep level of sharing the plant and having that be part of us and helping to modulate. And we even see that with adaptogens, right? Kind of like the beauty of how a plant can help us to adapt to our environment, to give us a little bit more stimulation if we need it. I mean, that has long been seen in traditional medicine frameworks. The other thing we don't revere is aging, right? So we don't revere aging or elderhood, and we don't revere plants. And it's like two of the things that I feel like could even converge. And I feel like we're really at a loss not bringing certain things together. But when I say that plants will save us, one of the things, since I teach on environmental health, is there's a lot of concern that my colleagues and I have about things like microplastics. I mean, just to think that what do we have? Like the equivalent of 7 grams of microplastics and nanoplastics in brain tissues.
Right.
And one of the things to help offset the effects of those nano and microplastics may potentially be polyphenols. So, and I
Interesting.
don't think we have a lot of solutions to a lot of these toxicants, these environmental toxicants, but I do think that plants can help to undo a lot of that damage. So if we are not buffering from the effects of the toxicant in the initial phases, then I think some of the oxidative stress, the inflammation that results can be helped by things like polyphenols or even carotenoids. But again, it's like that Goldilocks principle where we need just the right amount. And
Yeah.
this is why not supra-physiologic dosing, whether through a supplement or other type of, I would say just any other kind of modality is best, because we don't want to flip that phytochemical into a different kind of function.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it feels like yeah, there's great potential for these things to have untoward effects that we don't fully understand if we're, as you opened up this conversation, we're really deviating from that traditional relationship with food to highly potentizing it, synthesizing it, and just assuming that it's good for us when we don't really know, sometimes. I think I
Yeah.
want to I want to touch on the whole plants will save us thing because that's a fun thing to talk about. And it's something I've been thinking about a bit as well, is like this reverence for nature around us, and I think in general, probably the most of humanity do resonate with this, is like we do have reverence for living things all around us all the time, and we see spirit and, connection in things. I think it's probably just inherent in humanity, but it does feel like our modern sort of heavily influenced by, that Western European sort of movement around the globe, that sort of culture is more about commodity and reductionism, and nature is not something to be revered. It's something to own or harvest or, turn into a product or along those lines. And, I'm just wondering, like, and you're deep in this area of reconnecting people with food from a spiritual perspective. Like how can we bridge that gap and get people to revere more their connection with food and plants?
I guess the best way that I can explain that is I just had a recent client, and she's in her late 50s, and like many of us, just kind of scrambling with everyday life, trying to get it all in, but yet wanting it all, right? Because you really do want that sense of community. You do want that sense of a spiritual practice because it's good for you and it feels good. You want to eat right, you want to sleep right, you want to poop right, you want to do everything right. So it's like, how do you do all of this in one day? So one of the things we talked about was, well, I just mentioned habit stacking, kind of like merging things together into one. So, as an example, making eating a spiritual practice. Like instead of going out to join a spiritual community, but you can do that too if you want. But why not take eating and make it your spiritual practice? So one of the things that I've done over the years, because I'm one of those people, I want it all, and I know all of these things are good for you, and I really resonate with a number of the different things like nutrition and spirituality. So one of the things I did in my kitchen, and I'm talking with you, thinking of all the clinicians listening and just giving ideas. So in our kitchen, I use the windowsill as like, I think it's too strong to say an altar, but it's a very sacred space. So I have things like my little statues of things, and I have little artwork. I have plants that have meaning for me. I have different crystals and stones that I like to look at in the morning because, how we're informing our vision and our sense of beauty. And I call it the ABCs, right? The sense of art, beauty, and creativity. And I feel like those are nutrients too. And spirituality is very much connected into those ABCs. So setting up the windowsill, getting that going, and like my breakfast is like a whole thing. My husband knows, like we even woke up this morning and he was about to make his breakfast. And I'm like, wait a minute, you know that I'm like breakfast queen here. Like this is my spiritual practice. He has to get up early on certain days. So sometimes he starts that. But, to me, it's like, how do we create spirituality within the everyday and the every moment? So sitting at the table, like just having intention. I think that there are little things that we can encourage clients to incorporate that evoke a sense of intention. And in functional medicine, I know we talk about spirituality being purpose, meaning, and connection. I would also add to that list, personally, I also feel like it's intention, it's awareness, and it's consciousness. So in my mind, if I'm thinking making breakfast is a spiritual practice, it becomes spiritual It's whatever we assign our perspective and our framework around that. So then you don't have to, go out and do spirituality separate and say, oh, I just have to meditate here in this time slot of my day. No, because everything you're doing becomes spiritual,
Yeah, I love
right? It has meaning.
it's so cool. I mean, that is such a brilliant idea, and it's not something I've ever really thought about before, is like thinking of the kitchen or the food environment as a sacred space. I mean, that's amazing. And also those little things, to and the way you frame it is not it's not really religious or even I guess it is spiritual, but it's very agnostic. So it's really just grounding yourself in, being present and acknowledging things. And I do remember actually once you joined us for a dinner while you were in London once with a few other people, and I still remember it quite distinctly. You sort of stopped everyone before they ate and got them to be present and sort of acknowledge some sort of intention around the food, which I was very powerful, but very simple at the same time, and not, one of the dangers with spiritual practice is it can be a bit woo-woo, or it can be a bit hard to do, or, it's like, where do I even start? But, these very simple, grounded exercises that could be done on a day-to-day basis, really powerful.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that back. I forgot about that. But yeah, that's one of the things that I learned from one of my teachers, where before we would start a meal, instead of imposing upon the group like a religious invocation of like a prayer, which not everybody feels comfortable with, just saying an intention, one word intention. Everybody just goes around, and it could be something like friendship, community, love, grace. People have said different things. Um, so yeah, again, I feel like spirituality, in fact, you and I had this conversation a little bit when we were just together, but I feel like within functional medicine, within the matrix, to me, spirituality is the frame of that whole matrix, because our spiritual view, the way that we approach life, our perspective, shapes how we work with a client or even how we approach our day. It approaches our body systems, right? So I feel like science is the method, spirituality is the overarching operating system of how we navigate life and our decisions.
Hmm.
And so, and even, I mean, just to bring it into a biochemistry aspect, because I've been looking into this a little bit more, the different phytochemicals and the different cell signalers that can even evoke self-transcendence. There's a lot of even older research, believe it or not, looking at different serotonin receptors. And if I can recall it right, I think it's 5T-1A. Like there's one specific serotonin receptor that is connected to greater self-transcendence. So you could ask the question, is spirituality genetically wired into us? Like, do we have receptors where we receive it through the action of certain things like phytochemicals or neurotransmitters or hormones that plug into those receptors to initiate gene expression of proteins that would lead us into a more spiritual mindset?
Hmm.
So it's almost like, well, what comes first, chicken or the egg? Are we born constitutionally, spiritually capable, and that just becomes part of who you are? Because why isn't everybody like that?
Hmm.
Are there personalized approaches to spiritual health that we need to acknowledge as clinicians? And I think we do. Even my father, who is 77, he is now retired, regretfully so, because, I feel like his whole purpose and meaning of life has been around his work. So when you don't have that anymore, how do you now engage in your sense of purpose and meaning? So
Hmm.
spirituality and spiritual health, it's one of the determinants of health and well-being. And I would say, especially as we move into our elder years, right? How do we start to redefine ourselves now that we don't have the overlay of all the different projects and books and things that we were preoccupied with? Now we have stillness. And we start looking at life a bit differently in terms of what are we leaving behind? What gives meaning? And what you and I heard at the IFM conference was, and this was from Tracy Gaudette's talk and Mary Jo Kreitzer, was not what is the matter with you, but what matters most to you.
Hmm.
And I feel like we need to be asking ourselves that question every decade because it's going to change every decade. I remember Jeff Bland talking about that when he turned 60. It was kind of like, the 60s are about you start thinking about your legacy. And I mean, I'm in my 50s. So, I think about, I feel like this is a great time of life. I still have my health. And so I feel like I want to contribute. But every generation and every decade is going to bring different challenges and different opportunities. And all the while, we have spirituality kind of as the bedrock of all of that, kind of quietly leading us. And then eventually it becomes louder and louder as a lot of things start to kind of dissipate. And then we're left with what we're really about.
Yeah. I mean that's a really big, powerful idea, and I think a lot for listeners to digest there. But the sorry, keep on with the puns, but I think one of the things that really stood out for me was that intersection between phytochemicals and spiritual awareness. And there are definitely examples of this in the literature where you can see an impact of phytonutrients and other nutrients as well on things that we often overlook, like intelligence, cognition, um, compassion, flourishing, like, but we just don't talk about this stuff because our culture and medical culture in particular is so focused on disease. So we've got loads of studies on food for depression now, but how many do we have for like flourishing, or has anyone even looked at spirituality yet? Like that is a big idea. It's that's
Let's
that.
do a study, Ben.
Yeah.
Uh, Basically, I love what you're saying because even when I was in the UK last year, I presented on this, how plant foods in general can help us with mental health.
Mm,
And so looking at less psychological distress, like you mentioned, flourishing, there was a really neat article about that, better mood state, less anxiety. And in fact, just even looking at more dietary diversity could incur better mood states, just even being diverse. And to me, that signals neuronal plasticity, signals better brain health overall, right? Because we're changing things up. And there is this one article, I think it's something like on carrots and curiosity, and looking at different plant food intake and looking at how we're fortifying the brain. I think one of your questions to me in advance of this podcast was talking about fruit,
yeah.
which is kind of an interesting one because it's a very polarizing topic. And people always ask me, Deanna, think about fruit. Don't they just increase blood sugar? And, I've been told by my doctor not to eat fruit. However, if you look at some of the studies, what you see is that there's a decreased risk of depressive symptom score with increased fruit intake. Isn't that wild? And then there was one other study, I can't give you the citation off the top of my head, but it was looking at fruits and vegetables and finding that fruits were more specific to helping with depressive symptoms.
Hmm.
So I just find that that's kind of interesting. Why have we veered so far away from fruit intake, something to possibly add to our happiness?
Yeah.
And maybe it's a seasonal thing too, where we need more of those antioxidants in the summer months when fruit is more readily available. We have a different mood state typically in the warmer summer months, and maybe fruit is contributory to that. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, we don't want to go overboard on fruits either, because then we may incur some of those glycemic impacts.
Yeah.
So again, it's the happy balance of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, it is quite polarized. But the weird thing is there's a bit of a disconnect between the literature and that polarization. So a lot of the anti-fruit stuff is more, coming from sources outside of the scientific literature, I would say. The only case where it would be particularly relevant is like on low carb, very low carbohydrate diets, perhaps. But even things like fructose intolerance in the scientific literature are really speaking more to avoiding refined fructose in processed foods. It's not fruit that's the problem, like, because the density of fructose is so low, you can eat an apple if you have fructose intolerance, not a problem. It's,
Exactly.
it's pastries and cakes and so on. So I think, a fun area to get into just to add to the controversy is some of the more extreme approaches that are emerging at the moment. You know where I'm going with this. It's like very low carb or even carnivore, where you know, I don't want to discredit, like, people are having good experiences on these sometimes, which I think personally, I think we need to ask why. What is it that's working there? But there does seem to be a trend towards completely eliminating plants. Do you want to speak a bit to that and your perspective? Because it's quite at odds with what we've just spoken about.
Well, I agree with you. I think that there's room for all kinds of therapeutic interventions for set time frames, right? And I do think that some people need a reset or a reprieve from what they were eating, and moving over to something like a carnivore diet may actually help. It's almost like a mono diet if you think of it, right? Because it's all just a lot of protein and it's all animal based. So, and what I have seen clinically in certain people is that moving at least for a shorter period of time to something more like a mono diet. So if we think of like the least allergenic foods, like I remember learning from Dr. Bob Lehrman, like lamb, sweet potato, rice, just putting somebody on like a bland diet for some time just can help to stabilize people. So I acknowledge that, and I can acknowledge that some people may need certain nutrients, and so possibly the meat provides that. But we're all still tethered to plants. Those animals are still eating plants. But you, as the end receiver of that carnivore diet, are not getting the benefit of fiber, the prebiotic effects. You're not getting a lot of different types of minerals and vitamins. On the flip side, you might be getting certain ones that might be relevant.
Yeah,
So what's interesting about the carnivore diet, though, if I'm just thinking about a few people that are the spokespeople of that way of eating, at least in the States, is that some of them have allowed for fruit to come in, like fruit and honey and meat.
hmm.
Oh, it's kind of like we saw with an Atkins approach from long ago, where it was really hardcore, just in protein and fat, and then it kind of morphed into a more balanced approach. And I kind of feel like the carnivore diet is now within certain circles is okay. Let's allow certain fruits at certain times of year and bring in things that are, again, more natural, like honey.
Yeah,
So it's morphing a little bit. And again, as Jeff Bland would say, the pendulum is always swinging in nutrition, which is why, again, adopting a more sustainable way of eating
yeah,
with perhaps like temporal, I would say, interventions like the elimination diet, I have to say, is truly a diet and is meant to be temporary and short term and works wonders for people.
yeah,
Really do, in my experience, they have really improved on an elimination diet. It's such a great level set. So,
yeah,
with the carnivore diet, it might be something temporarily for people to explore. Um, but yeah,
yeah.
you better make sure that your protein digestion, that you don't have metabolic endotoxemia. I mean, there are just a lot of things to be on the lookout for clinically.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's a bit like any diet that is, I don't know if extreme's the right word, but restricts whole food groups, or it's you could argue that it's the same even with vegetarianism or veganism. There are watch outs because you will become deficient in certain
Yeah,
things, and the long-term effect of that is concerning potentially.
it
So
can be.
yeah,
Let
yeah,
me get your thought on this too, because this is one of my, over the years, as I have lectured on the mitochondria, and even most recently at your conference, one of the things that came to me, and I don't have any literature, science to support this, but I'm curious to get your thoughts, is if the hub of our metabolism is truly through the mitochondrion, and so oxidative phosphorylation, I mean, how we deal with energy sources from the diet are through this little organelle, which is from the maternal DNA. Do we need to explore looking at the lineage of the maternal line with respect to food? Is there something that our mitochondria have seen over time that we need to be in tune with? So in other words, do we need more maternal ancestral diets to key into potentially kind of the long-served needs of energy by the mitochondria?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean the easy answer that, I'd probably need to think about that a bit more, but the easy answer is it's very likely. Like if you just look at a practical, relatively well-established example of like genetic variants, like single nucleotide polymorphism variants and the variant in activity of different enzymes, often which intersect with food and diet. That's inherited. It's through multiple generations over, decades or thousands of years of environmental exposures that our body is adapted to, including food. It's quite likely that there are long-standing multi-generational influences on, cellular energy metabolism that would have direct implications for personalized nutrition. That makes sense. But there's probably bigger things that I beyond my comprehension around this that it would be important as well. Like, because the whole of cellular metabolism is sort of hangs on food. You can say gene variants, yeah, but then there's like, the mitochondrial membrane is heavily dependent on diet and, you know, the interaction with different enzymes that shuttle the energy into the cell and so on and so on. So yeah, it makes sense that there would be a connection, and it is like the big elephant in the room, isn't it? Like we talk about ancestral diets and, traditional Mediterranean diet. But what'd be really cool to know is like where you came from as an individual and what your ancestors ate, because there's no such thing as a paleo diet. Like what people were eating in the Paleolithic in Europe was very different to the Paleolithic in Central America, which was very difficult, and so on and so on. I'm not just talking about grains, like, the Paleolithic diet contained grains depending on where you were, and it was seasonal. Um, so yeah, that'd be cool to work out is like what is your history as a person, and we just don't know that stuff.
No, and we don't know the significance or even the contribution. But where my thinking was going was when you asked me about the carnivore diet, is the the curiosity that people have with exploring different extreme diets, if you will, an attempt to kind of harken back to perhaps something ancestral, or because meat and a carnivore approach I could see would be very fundamental to certain lineages.
Hmm.
So is it kind of like, do we feel called to that? And some people might say, well, maybe that's a blood type thing. And, there's that whole portal of conversation. But, it just kind of begs the question, like, where does the impetus for our need to explore certain dietary patterns, where does that really come from? Where does that originate? So what is in the signal before the signal?
Yeah.
I'm always curious, like, what is like the precursor to in functional medicine, we're kind of looking at the end result of a lot of things, whether through labs or, even genes. We're still looking at functional labs to look at the functionality of those genes. But what is priming psychological exploration or the need to follow a certain diet? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just interesting. And sometimes I think we need to take a more well-rounded exploration to things to kind of uncover and foster our relationship with food in a more, again, a more creative way that gives us a little bit more of an eye-opening portal into like the why.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like a big unexplored area in nutrition in general. These hereditary influences, which you've touched on, but also just behavior in general. Like what drives people to do things. On one hand, with a carnivore diet or any other diet, people may be motivated for health reasons to try and get an improvement in symptoms, but there are many other reasons people engage with food and different dietary approaches. As you say, it could be primal, it could be ancestral, it could be trying to reconnect with things and there may, sense of spirituality, who knows? Like there could be all sorts of things that are driving, the way people are thinking, but it just feels like a hugely untapped area in terms of our understanding of what motivates people.
Yeah. And how would you even study that, right? It's so complex. I
Yeah.
think for the clinicians listening, one of the fun tools that I have used clinically is a timeline that is an eating timeline. You know how we use the timeline in functional medicine to kind of chart somebody's symptoms and the point of origin. But I like to just use the timeline for eating. And I give it a little bit of structure by saying, like, give me the top 10 events that framed your eating relationship, like wherever you want to start, but just 10. And so we kind of, and I've workshopped this as well. But then underneath your relationship, going with your mother's relationship as much as you remember, and even the grandmother's relationship, like what do you remember about your grandmother? What were you told about your grandmother's connection to food? My grandparents were on a farm in Wisconsin. So it was a dairy farm.
Hmm.
So it's interesting. I had dairy in my maternal diet, right? So I know so many people are polarized to dairy, but my genes have seen that. So it's just kind of interesting, if we start to like map three lines,
Yeah.
all parallel, but we start with ourselves and then we engage in a little bit of exploration with our mother, just as much as we know, or if she's still living, to ask her. And then again, the grandmother, and kind of like, look, where are the threads that interconnect? Again, pattern recognition of like,
Yeah.
oh, I crave dairy. I don't crave dairy, but I'm just giving this as an example, like to kind of see where are those cravings? Where is though the draw?
Yeah.
Where is that potentially kind of coming from? Is there an ancestral connection transgenerationally? I don't know.
Yeah.
Just fun to look at.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think you certainly see that in Europe, where people have got a very strong sense of food identity. Like there is a really strong connection
Yes.
to food culture, and they're very diverse cultures, but where you're from is a huge determinant of, what you want to eat, basically.
That is
How,
so
yeah,
true. You can see that in Europe and the UK very, very distinctly.
yeah.
There isn't a lot of mobilization, right? It's kind of like, the families carry on similar patterns.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of people like genetically have been there for, tens of thousands of years. Like it's, or thousands. So yeah, it's old food history and food culture. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I think we're going to have to draw to a close. And, we've covered some ground. We've gone through color and culture and behavior and the biological and practical implications of that. And I think it sort of marries together your overall approach really well, where you've built out this, connection to color for people and then intersected it with biology and function and spirituality. So, unless you've got any closing remarks for listeners, we might draw to a close.
Yeah, no, I feel like you took me on an intellectual and imaginative tour of topics, which is kind of nice and refreshing. But yeah, I guess I would just bring it back to like the four top things that I always come back to, which would be color, making sure that people have the color signal so that we're getting those phytochemicals. And then you have the artful engagement, the creativity. I feel like that is really something that I would like to see eventually built into the functional medicine matrix, or even for clinicians to ask your patients, how do you define creativity? Because we could actually wax on creativity like we did with spirituality. What is creativity? I know I would define that probably different than even you would define it, right? We all have personalized versions of that. And I feel like that needs to come into health and healing. The third thing would be the diversity.
Mhm.
So there's a whole conversation to be had about that, but we touched on that. And then the fourth is the rhythm. And I know we talked about circadian rhythm and seasonal rhythm. I would encourage everybody to think about all the rhythms. We have lunar rhythm, we have the menstrual rhythm, we have the hormonal rhythms. You even have the month of birth rhythms. So where there was that study looking at hospital records and looking at what conditions people developed, and you can start to see clusters of people that are born in March versus November have different predispositions to certain risks for certain diseases.
Hmm.
So do we need to even look at the month of our birth? You and I have the same month of birth. So, that's kind of like our time zero of like, okay, we look at ourselves from that point forward. Maybe that's when we start to get our labs. So anyway, that just speaks to rhythm, that speaks to cycles, and it speaks to nature. So those four things to me are kind of what I see as clinical underpinnings and easy gateways into conversations with clients.
Yeah, no, and thank you for wrapping up like that. I think it speaks to some of the originality and creativity that you're breathing into nutrition and functional medicine. And on behalf of the listeners, I'd really like to just acknowledge the great work that you do. We're really appreciative of all the commitment you've made over the years, and your role as an educator and researcher and scientist, and just in general, like pushing things forward. It's something that always strikes me about conversations I have with you. It's almost like creativity is just flowing through, and that really comes back into the kind of medicine that we're doing, and helps progress it in a positive way. So, thank you for that great work.
We're on the same wavelength, Ben. What can I say? We're in this together, and it's great.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun and more to come. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.